Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In presenting this bill, I wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us in the chamber today. How fortunate we are to meet here, to live here on such beautiful lands, on country that has served as a meeting place for generations. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have cared for this country, guided by a profound understanding of land, law, and community. Today, we recognise not only their enduring right to self-determination, but also the wisdom, resilience, and service local Aboriginal people continue to offer in preserving this land, strengthening culture, and caring for community. There's so much that non-Aboriginal Australia must learn and unlearn from the leadership, knowledge systems and ways of being that have sustained this continent for millennia. May we listen more deeply, walk more humbly and strive to be better allies in a shared future built on justice, truth-telling and respect. This bill affirms a truth that's long overdue. Closing the gap is everyone's job, not just that of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, who continue to bear the heaviest burdens of injustice, but instead a shared responsibility across government, across systems, and across this Assembly. This bill is about embedding that shared responsibility into law, into the way our public service works and the way our institutions are held accountable. In 2020, the ACT government made a commitment by signing the National Agreement on Closing the Gap. They made a commitment, an historic agreement between all Australian governments and the coalition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peak organisations. And the nature of that commitment is simple, but it's profound: to overcome the entrenched inequality faced by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, such that their life outcomes are equal to those of all Australians. But the reality 5 years on is sobering. The Productivity Commission, in its independent review released in February 2024, found that governments are not prioritising the structural reforms at the heart of the agreement. It concluded, and I quote, that the transformation of government organisations has barely begun, that accountability is lacking, and that progress remains weak because of business-as-usual approaches. Just last week, the first Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander-led review of the agreement echoed this sentiment. It found that, despite the language of genuine partnership, government departments continue to operate in traditional ways, setting the agenda, controlling extremely short timeframes, and expecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations to respond on their terms, on the government's terms. The Aboriginal-led review urges governments to step up, to embed systemic change into employment contracts and leadership KPIs as a way of driving transformation from within. And so it is incumbent on us in this place to respond to that call, not with lip service and inertia, but with action. This bill can mark the beginning of that action. The first part of the bill amends the Annual Reports Government Agencies Act 2004. It will require Directors General to report annually on the tangible actions their areas, their directorates are taking, and the outcomes of those actions in implementing the priority reforms of the National Agreement. The reforms that are critical to transforming the way the government works with Aboriginal people and communities. They require government to work in genuine formal partnerships and to share decision-making with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, to strengthen the capacity of the Aboriginal community-controlled sector and transition service delivery to ACOs, to commit to systemic and structural transformation of government agencies to better respond to the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and to prioritise Indigenous data sovereignty so that Aboriginal people can make data-informed decisions that benefit their communities. This bill will also require that in their annual reports, government agencies detail how each directorate has responded to recommendations from both the Productivity Commission review and the Aboriginal-led review. And importantly, the reporting format must be agreed upon by the ACT Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elected body, ensuring transparency is shaped in partnership with those to whom we owe accountability. This part of the bill gives legislative effect to Essential Action 4.3 of last year's Productivity Commission review, which made clear that without public reporting, we cannot measure or maintain progress. The second part of the bill amends the Public Sector Management Act 1994 to establish a new statutory duty, the closing the gap principle. It will require every ACT public servant to perform their job in accordance with this principle. And that means demonstrating personal cultural capability and contributing to the cultural capability of their workplace, upholding the national agreement's principles, promoting cultural safety, and working to eliminate institutional racism in their workplace. This is about changing the how of public service delivery. It's about recognising that outcomes won't change until attitudes, structures, and behaviours change. If this bill passes, these expectations won't just sit in policy binders or HR memos or be discussed in this place. They will be reflected in employment contracts and performance frameworks. Government leaders, from the head of service to directors general to senior executives, will be required to lead by example, to not only manage change, but to model it, to not only support reform, but to embody it. This part of the bill gives effect to Essential Action 3.5 from the Productivity Commission review, as well as reflecting Recommendation 2 from the Aboriginal-led review, which found that, quote, racism continues to be a defining issue preventing progress. Governments are yet to begin to address the identification and elimination of racism in any substantive way. And that, quote, cultural safety initiatives were overwhelmingly described as transactional, compliance-based exercises that failed to lead to meaningful or sustained change. Madam Assistant Speaker, we need to be honest about the situation here in the ACT. The most recent Closing the Gap dashboard update tells a deeply troubling story. Nationally, we are on track to meet just 4 of 19 Closing the Gap targets. 11 are off track, 4 are getting worse. Locally, the ACT is improving in some areas, yes, and so we should be, we promise to. But we're also going backwards in other areas. The proportion of Aboriginal children in out-of-home care in the ACT has increased since we signed the agreement. An Aboriginal child is 12.5 times more likely to be in out-of-home care in the ACT than a non-Indigenous child. An Aboriginal young person in the ACT is 14 times more likely to be in youth detention than a non-Indigenous young person. Aboriginal adults are 22.7 times more likely to be incarcerated in the ACT than non-Indigenous adults, the largest Indigenous incarceration gap in the country. Persistent homelessness affects nearly half of the Aboriginal people seeking help in the ACT, again the worst rate nationally. 41.5% of Aboriginal households in public housing here live in a dwelling that is not of an acceptable standard, defined as having at least 4 working facilities to wash people, clothes or bedding, to store and prepare food, a working sewage system, and no more than 2 major structural defects. 41.5%. We need to ask ourselves why that figure drops to 24% among non-Aboriginal households in our city's public housing dwellings. A 17.5% percentage point gap. And perhaps worse, to our eternal shame, 76% of Aboriginal adults in the ACT reported experiencing racial prejudice in the last 6 months, the highest rate in the country. These are not abstract figures, Madam Assistant Speaker. They are indicators that our systems continue to fail Aboriginal people. Systemic failure requires systemic reform, which is what this bill will bring about. Nor are these just statistics. We need to remember the people for whom these experiences are their daily reality. I've spoken previously in this place about my conversations with a local Aboriginal woman pregnant and running for her life, as she said, the reporter being turned away from a service provider because she didn't meet the criteria. Other women have told me of their fears that seeking help will result in their children being removed. And for one Aboriginal woman I spoke with, that's exactly what happened. We also know that Aboriginal people are often forced to rely on one another when our institutions fail. One public housing tenant contacted government officials seeking support for an Aboriginal couple who were squatting in a neighbouring flat and would otherwise have been homeless. The government's response was to cut the power off. How out of touch can our government be, not just with our community's needs, but also with its own commitments, if that is the response to people in crisis? It was the neighbour and a local community service that he volunteered for, not the government that stepped up to help. And we know cultural safety remains a live issue at the AMC, where an Aboriginal detainee was recently moved into the very cell where his cousin had just died, having first been temporarily located in the cell where his uncle had died, despite his pleas to be placed elsewhere. This is the context for the reforms in this bill. It's why legislation matters, because the status quo is failing many Aboriginal people here in our city every day. The national agreement isn't going to implement itself. And, Madam Assistant Speaker, the leadership demonstrated by our local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community through advocacy, service, and deep cultural wisdom is nothing short of inspiring. It is also a cause for introspection. We must ask, why are those who have been harmed most by systemic injustice expected to lead the efforts to fix it? How can it be that those who've been wronged are most committed to reconciliation? The Aboriginal-led review just released found that, quote, there are stark imbalances in responsibilities, commitments and resourcing between parties to the national agreement. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander bodies are carrying the heavier load with significantly less resourcing compared to government. Government institutions need to carry a heavier load and must now lead the repair. The Public Sector Closing the Gap Legislation Amendment Bill 2025 provides a pathway to do just that. A pathway towards shared responsibility, genuine accountability, structural change and true reconciliation. As one local Aboriginal leader put it, we just want government officials to come to the table, to do their fair share of the work, to walk forward with us. That's what this bill requires. It's a good first step. It's not symbolic, it's structural. It changes the rules of the game. It embeds responsibility, transparency and leadership where it belongs, in the public institutions that exist to serve all of us. My Assembly colleagues, please support the bill. We have an opportunity in the ACT not just to say yes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but to mean it. We can show the rest of the country how to fundamentally change the way that we engage with members of our First Nations community. I truly believe reconciliation is possible here in the ACT. It is a journey, but it's also an objective that can and must be achieved. We need to move forward together, and we can, but only if we're all involved and fully committed. And that needs to be reflected not just in supportive words like these in this chamber, which thankfully here in our Assembly we hear frequently, but also in law, policy, and in the culture of government institutions. I also believe that we can close the gap in life outcomes between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians, and that it's ethically inexcusable to sign an agreement committing to do exactly that without following through. Colleagues, by voting in support of this bill when it's brought on for debate later this year, you can make clear to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members in the gallery here today and across the ACT that you share these beliefs, that you agree that closing the gap is everyone's job. I commend the Public Sector Closing the Gap Legislation Amendment Bill 2025 to the Assembly.